See ya.
Order. I did not make the comment.
Bill is not about taking away rights. It is about giving opportunity.
Good, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Over the next 2 weeks, Citizen A is focusing like a laser beam on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Conference taking place in Auckland. Joining me tonight to discuss the ramification of free trade with our new American corporate overlords, she is one of New Zealand's best-known academics and critics of free trade, Professor of Law, Policy and International Economic Regulation, Professor Jane Kelsey. And he is the legal advisor for one of the great unions of the world, the Teamsters, a former Labour lawyer and the lead coordinator of the 1999 Battle in Seattle, veteran American political organizer, Mike Dolan. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, issue 1, can Tim Grosser negotiate in New Zealand's interests when he's applying for the top job at the WTO? Issue 2, John Key says TPP will make us $3.5 billion. WikiLeaks cables show the New Zealand negotiator complaining to the US that we get nothing out of the deal. Who was right? And issue 3 tonight, how does an unprecedented lockout from the Conference of NGOs, Unions and Community Groups impacted by the TPP bode for democracy issues? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off tonight with issue 1. The 15th round of convincing us to allow American corporations unyielding political sovereignty kicked off this week, but when our chief negotiator, Tim Grosser, is also applying for the top job at the WTO, whose interest is he representing? Jane, the PM says we can't hold negotiations out in the open. Yet this week, Tim Grosser was interviewed by the Inside US Trade publication saying that he can negotiate an opening up of Pharmac and manage any outcry at home over it. Is Grosser negotiating for New Zealand's interests or the interests of the WTO?
I think Grosser's negotiating for Grosser's ideology. I mean, we've had extraordinary claims this week. We've had the Prime Minister plucking figures out of the air. We've had him rewriting what our constitutional process is about how these treaties are made. You've had unbelievable OTT rhetoric from Grosser, of the kind that I think will be quite damaging to him in his moves to take the leadership at the WTO. But it just shows how desperate they now are. You know, they really are on the back foot, and there's no pretense of reasonable dialogue any longer. They're throwing out all of these lies in the hope that the media will report them, which it does, and that our rebuttals will get minimal airtime. And that really is a sign of desperation.
If Grosser's going for the top job at the WTO, how do we know any of the negotiation that he's currently doing right now is in our benefit?
Well, I remember when I talked to him when he used to chair the agriculture negotiations at the WTO when he was over there as our ambassador, and he was supposedly the independent chair as well. I said to him, Tim, how do you do this whilst you're also the New Zealand ambassador? And he said, oh, well, I'd never conclude something that really wasn't in New Zealand's interests. And that I thought was a really interesting admission. He probably denied he said it. But you know, his job is really to cajole in the negotiating environment and bullshit in the domestic environment.
Right. Mike, help me understand the American political system a little bit here. We keep hearing that we shouldn't panic about the DPP passing because US politicians will never sign away their agricultural protections. Is that true, or do corporations in America just hold a lot more sway?
It's a good question, Martin. First of all, let me just say thank you very much. It's great to be on your show.
Pleasure.
I'm here on behalf of our 1.4 million members. The team's is 1.4 million members. And I represent them in Washington, D.C. I'm also representing them in these negotiations in New Zealand because, well, 31,000 of them are in the dairy industry. I work usually lobbying on Capitol Hill, and one of the larger caucuses that I work with is the bipartisan Congressional Dairy Caucus. Both parties looking out for America's dairy interests. At this point, and they're not represented in these negotiations, but at this point it seems that they're prepared for this battle around market access for our dairy industry, for example, to be joined in the Congress next year. As these, and I will be working with the dairy industry, who is our bosses, the employers, right? The Congressional Caucus, both parties, both sides of the Hill, the House and the Senate, and there will be. There will be negotiations and a confrontation that will make the current fiscal cliff negotiations look like a day at the beach. It'll look like a picnic. And that's really the battle is going to be joined. And I'm here really in Auckland to, give the negotiators, and particularly in New Zealand, the agricultural and the dairy industry here, a preview of those coming attractions. That this fight is going to be joined, and we are not going to concede political space to the transnational corporate lobby to begin with, and we're going to look out for dairy farmers who are in cooperatives in our country, as they are in this country, and for the dairy workers.
So, I mean, the chances of your members, your politicians, saying yes to this and voting for it while killing off their own dairy farmers, what's the chance of that actually going through?
Very small. I mean, that's my point. Now, Canada has joined these negotiations for the first time, and they are at the table. Jane and I, we're merely stakeholders. We're merely near the table.
Right.
Outside the building.
Outside the building.
Yeah,
a little farther from the table than we like to be ordinarily.
The Canadians aren't going to handle any of their dairy subsidies.
See, that's the point. They kept it off the table during the mother of all trade fights in the U.S., the NAFTA fight, and they kept dairy off the table many years ago. This is 1992, 93. So there's been a lot of milk has passed under the bridge since then, and a big part of the question is whether or not the Canadians will open up their market to access from the U.S. And if they do, then it mitigates a little bit of the damage that we would otherwise expect from the New Zealand dairy industry. Now, as the Teamsters, we represent workers on both sides of the border, in Canada and in the U.S. So at this point, there's really a lot of moving pieces to this debate around agriculture and about dairy. And of all the things that just might gum up this, these negotiations, this deal, dairy is really at the top of the list. And as you know, your negotiators, your industry, Fonterra, they've all said, if dairy's not, if our interests aren't taken care of, if dairy isn't number one, if we don't have the market access, we'll walk away. We will walk away from these negotiations. Wasn't it Malcolm Bailey? Malcolm Bailey said just the other day. So I guess I'm in Auckland, in New Zealand, to bring that message. I've been thinking a lot about Fonterra. And I want you to understand that we have nothing against Fonterra from the sense of its labor management relations. They actually have a really good relationship with the Dairy Workers Union, with the other unions, and all the rest. However, from the perspective of our members, whose livelihoods will be threatened by this agreement if New Zealand enjoys that full access, I have a feeling that walk-away moment that Malcolm Bailey was describing the other day,
it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. In fact, if you have Fonterra's fax number, I could just send this right over, just fax it to him today. Attention, Malcolm Bailey. That walk-away moment will be sooner than he expects.
Jane, pharmaceutical companies will open Pharmac to legal challenges if their procurement decisions, which their lobbyists admit will increase spending on a wider range of products. How does rising the cost of Pharmac, how does that help New Zealanders?
Oh, because it's going to be the trade-off that will get us all this dairy access.
So that's the deal?
Well, Grocer came out in public basically for the first time.
That's right.
The line has been the fundamentals of Pharmac will be safe. We will not trade them away. And now we see last week that the fundamentals of Pharmac mean the entity will continue to exist and it will be white-anted with the industry interests at the table. This morning I had a really interesting session with the lead US intellectual property negotiator talking about the so-called transparency chapter on what they call healthcare technologies, which is pharmaceuticals and things like hip replacements and those sorts of things. And all we want is due process and fairness and transparency, which means all we want is to have our drug companies being able right through every stage of Farmac's decision making to intervene, to pressure, to seek reviews, to challenge the criteria, which will result in busting the Farmac cap, which means that Farmac cannot do the kind of really hard deals it's done in the past. Say, we've got this pot of money, so you want us to subsidise you, then you're going to have to push down what you're asking. Now, if that gets all loosened up, then...
So the cost to New Zealand for hurting Mike's members in America being able to get our cheese and butter and milk into his country, the cost for us is going to be more expensive medicines. That's
Not
the trade-off?
well, that's part of the trade-off,
Right.
but of course the government is only mentioning 2 of the wide raft of issues. So it'll be the impacts on the internet, it'll be the restrictions on our ability to re-regulate in key areas like mining and finance and so on. So, I mean, they're just pretending...
That's the top of the top of the list.
They're pretending that this is really this nice, narrow little...
Sliver.
And it's enormous.
Mike, you've been a field director of the Citizens Trade Campaign and National Coalition of Labour, Environmental, Consumer and Farm Groups. Are their interests being pushed in this free trade agreement?
Certainly not, and they never have been, right? The great irony of this is that it was originally promoted, this TPP, when Obama inherited it from the previous administration, the P4 process. A 21st century agreement, high end, really. And we all thought that meant that the interests of civil society, after the debates since the NAFTA and the WTO and all the NAFTA model expansions and regional and bilateral agreements, that we were making incremental progress towards a better recognition of environmental standards incorporated into the core text of these agreements, of labor rights incorporated into the core
many
text.
of the mistakes recognised.
So he came in and Obama promised a certain high-end 21st century. We hear it again and again and again in promotion of this TPP, and yet the entrenched bureaucracies of the United States Trade Representative and of the other governments here are still moving in a direction that subordinates our values and our interests, our bottom lines, to corporate interests. Once again, it's been a source of some disappointment to the Citizens Trade Campaign in this country, to the alliances, the fair trade alliances in the other countries as well. But you mentioned all the constituencies, and we are united: environment, labor, family farmers, consumers, the human rights activists. There is a general consensus on the left, plus the concerns about sovereignty that populists on the right are worried about. There is a critical mass of disappointment that I think is going to be politically effective, politically dispositive in this next year or so.
Final question to both of you. The TPP will open up state-owned enterprises to corporate litigation. Aren't we crossing lines of political sovereignty here? Should governments be able to protect domestic industries from corporate lowest-cost capitalism?
Mike and I have a somewhat different position on the state enterprises because their unions, in fact, have been supportive of what's been put on the table that all the other countries have resisted. But of course it's about sovereignty. I mean, the whole thing is about sovereignty. And you know, it goes back to what Gross has said. We have problems with excessive sovereignty and we need to rebalance. Well, the state enterprises is merely part of it, and I mean, we just need to look at TV. You know, TVNZ, what have we got? We've got a fully corporatised public broadcasting system whose sole function is to produce a 7% dividend to the government. And we've seen how many renationalisations through failed privatisations. So for us, the issues are about that model and a different kind of state responsibility in fulfilling its public good functions.
And I'll just add to that that our concern with respect to state-owned enterprises, which is really much more directed at
South America,
well,
China.
some other country, China. I mean, you know, the big gorilla than it is at New Zealand's experience. Around
But we're collateral damage in it. That's the problem.
And there are so collateral damage.
Left, right, and centre on this,
You could write a book about the collateral damage of these trade agreements when sovereignty is, as you say, on the table. But if there is a regime under the TPP or else that allows for greater transparency, a way of understanding how SOEs are working in the marketplace, with that fuller information, then the playing field is leveled, and that would be our only...
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2. John Key said this week the TPP would generate $3.5 billion in for New Zealand, yet WikiLeaks revealed cables of New Zealand negotiators complaining New Zealand got nothing from the deal and trying to convince New Zealanders that it was a good deal would be the challenge. Mike, when working Americans are sold free trade deals over the years, how was the sales pitch spun and did the promises become reality?
Of course not. Through the same misdirection and misinformation that you're experiencing right now with respect to this conversation in New Zealand.
Yeah.
I'll give you a very good example. When Bill Clinton wanted to pass the NAFTA, he told us about the job creation that would accrue, that we would enjoy as a result of the NAFTA. And he linked job creation to exports, obviously, as one does. It made a calculation that every, I guess it was $1 billion of exports equals 10,000 new jobs, and continued that explanation about job creation without ever describing the underside of that argument, the opposite side, that what do the imports, let alone the export of jobs, what does that cost in terms of U.S. jobs? So the reality, after many years of NAFTA and its progeny, the other NAFTA models, the United States has lost millions and millions of jobs, good manufacturing jobs that unions like the Teamsters, represent our workers. So the big lie was that it was going to raise all the boats. I mean, you've heard the free trade argument. And I think, perhaps Jane, you'll agree with me on this, you're more the academic than I am, but it seems to me that this ideology of fair trade has been demonstrated to be a big lie, and to call these agreements free trade agreements as though there's some academic paradigm that is inevitable and true. In fact, it's a corporate managed regime that advances the interests of transnational corporations at the expense of workers, consumers, and the environment. So changing that frame, that meme, if you will, in these debates is the big challenge for civil society. And that's what we do, and our friends, on the political side of things in the Hill. This is exactly what the debate in 2013 will be all about, at least in my country, as these negotiations proceed.
Jane, Tim Grosser said in his June speech last year, and on the final, I predict, show in this very studio in November of last year, that claims of financial benefits are overblown. Are we being deliberately lied to, or is John Key serious about $3.5 billion worth of growth?
Well, Grosser said, I don't believe in econometric projection. Right? Sure enough, not only does the PM rely on, and we presume this because I've just put in an Official Information Act request to find out what he's based this $3 billion figure on, but I presume it's actually a study that was predicted 1.7 billion US, which unless the exchange rate has now plummeted to 50 cents to the dollar, then is very different. But that was based on an APEC-wide free trade agreement across 21 to 23 countries, with everyone giving up all of their barriers, with no projections of what any increased costs would be in terms of intellectual property or investor rights and so on, and without any assessment of what the impact on things like innovation would be. And there was a really interesting argument between Rod Oram and Mr. Bailey from the dairy sector at a symposium last Friday. And Rod's point was this notion of just taking down barriers so you can ship more milk powder into another country isn't an economic development model. We need value added, we need innovation, we need to actually take the straitjacket off, not the deregulatory approach, but provide real innovation support for our future industries. And that isn't in the agenda. But what we are hearing this week is this rhetoric, a mantra now. Economic growth and jobs. Economic growth and jobs. Economic growth and jobs. Prime Minister plucks out of the air a figure, 1.7 billion, 3 billion, any number, choose a number. It's got crazy. And to go back to my point, I think this is how desperate they are. And we've got to say, show us the proof and show us the texts so that we can analyse what the costs and benefits will be.
Mike, the US Chamber of Commerce says that if America is to achieve its high ambitions in intellectual property, cross-border data flows and state-owned enterprises, the US administration would have to screw up its courage and improve its market access offers. What does that spell for the average American farmer?
Well, the dairy farmers in particular, and I'm not an expert on agriculture issues. The Teamsters represent the workers. It's not good. Our dairy industry is, because of a drought and because of a lot of different factors, has since 2008 been experiencing a real downfall. Our only, I have to revert to the political here. I have to describe to you that the dairy farmers of America, the big processors, all through the supply chain, there is a collective concern about what these exact rhetoric is going to mean to our livelihoods. It's a pocketbook issue, and we'll be mobilizing to bring that exact argument to the Congress and to the administration.
Aren't we all Keynesians now after the 2007 financial collapse? I mean, we don't really believe this free market model now, do we?
Well, no, we don't. Some of us really actually never did. When David Ricardo described how Adam Smith's market theory works in the commerce among nations, he set some conditions about labor being able to move across borders with the same ease as capital, for example, and about how you don't have big surpluses or deficits. Well, all those conditions for the successful workings of what's it called? Competitive advantage, right? All that, would work. They don't, and yet we continue, in a definition of insanity, to continue to do the same thing over again, expecting some sort of a different result. And I think that the American people, and that includes the Canadian, all the North American people, after the experience of NAFTA, and then you all in this conversation are beginning to see that the emperor is wearing no clothes.
So Adam Smith's invisible hand is just a mugging in the dark. Jay, surely the Parliamentary Select Committee process will not advise us to sign an agreement that hurts us. Where is your faith in the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Select Committees? Where's your faith?
Well, it doesn't have any power.
None of those committees. They can hold it for 15 days, can't they? 2 weeks to read.
This is the outrage of a Prime Minister telling the public that Parliament has the final say in this agreement. He hasn't even read his cabinet manual. And we just need to go back to the New Zealand-Thailand FTA, where they were actually still holding the hearings on it before the Select Committee when the cabinet ratified the agreement. I mean, this is how outrageous the process is. And so we need the political parties to start saying, this is a democracy, and we need to decide, not our trust us Prime Minister deal maker, former money trader.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. How does an unprecedented lockout from the conference of NGOs, unions and community groups impacted by the TPP bode for democracy issues? Mike, why were stakeholders like your good self locked out? What was that about?
I confess I'm a little disappointed at the reception in New Zealand.
We're very sorry. We're very sorry.
I've been going to these things for a lot of years. I remember our reception in Seattle, Washington.
Great reception in Seattle.
The WTO. And they vary. I've been at this long enough that I'm, a little bit cynical about, what access is anymore. And it varies. I mean, remember after we shut down the WTO in Seattle in 1999, where did the WTO go next? To Doha.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it is, not exactly, steeped in a tradition and culture of expression, First Amendment, of freedom of expression and association.
Indeed.
I expected more here in New Zealand, and yet at some level I'm not surprised. Access to the stakeholders at the 15th round of these negotiations in the ring there and all the rest. They recognize that having stakeholders in there is, from their perspective, a distraction. We consider it obviously education, edification. We're trying to bring some rationality to the debate so that our values and those of the ordinary folks of New Zealand and the United States are heard.
But there are stakeholders and stakeholders.
Yes.
So there are corporate stakeholders, and then
that's a good point.
And they're quite happy to have the others there. But I think we have
a sign that they're actually a little bit worried if they're locking people like you out of the conference altogether now?
Well, we won't go down the path of the names I've been called in the last couple of weeks. But it's quite interesting if you look strategically at what they're trying to do. Next round, we understand, is likely to be in Singapore. So forget that. You need to have a permit for a meeting of 4 people. They have set this deadline for October. Talk of a political summit
Yep.
to pull it off. That means they're going to be working backwards for how to lock us out,
Yep.
how to get the PR line, to get their ducks in a row. If it means burning us off and acting in a arrogant manner, then that's the price they'll pay for getting the deal done. That's the way Grocer works.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
then if it means bypassing the democratic processes, then tough, that's the way it works too.
Final question to both of you. By ignoring the wider views of the various sort of stakeholders in society, who actually ends up benefiting from this bloody deal?
Well, you know the answer to that. It's the it's transnational corporations
Yep.
and the investment elites.
Yep.
You know, when I come to these other countries, the negotiating partners in this and other similar deals, you know, I always take the opportunity to meet with my opposite numbers, you know, and have an opportunity to mingle with the activists and to talk at the grassroots level. Because I have more in common with those people than either of us have with the investment elites and the big corporate, you know, big, you know, fat cats in either of our countries. This is, you know, to coin this phrase of a kind of a class warfare between two sets of competing values, and it's important to recognize that we're in solidarity with the workers of all these countries, as are the consumers, are the environmentalists, with their opposite numbers in those countries.
Who loses here? Because
Well, we lose.
clearly the winners are the corporates. Who are the losers?
We lose because we can't shape our own future.
Yeah.
Yeah? We've got a government that's on a kamikaze mission to be able to sign off whatever deals it can in the domestic domain, whether it's the privatisations or the mining companies or whatever. This is the lock-in strategy, right? So if they can get this under their belt as well, then the fact that the whole world is in the paradigm shift you were talking about before, even the IMF is now dropped its opposition to capital controls. I mean, all of the orthodoxies
Yeah,
are
big
going out the window, and what they're going to do is to say, sorry, signed this, can't change.
Let's wrap the show with final word. Jane, your final word this week is?
Well, we've got 4 or 5 more days of these talks to go. There'll be an activity on Saturday outside the Sky City Convention Centre when a petition of close to 750,000 will be presented to the lead negotiator from all around the world saying the world says no to the TPPA. It'd be great if people join us, but even if they just go to the websites, www.itsourfuture.org, if they go to the cartoon exhibition that's on at Biz Dojo, 155 Karangahape Road, or just simply take the ordinary kind of action that people can take with their MPs and others, that's the thing we have to do now, and we have to carry it on until that deadline they've set of October next year.
Mike, your final word this week.
I'll just echo what Jane has said. On Saturday, we'll be having a major mobilization. The whole world is watching, and I'll be looking forward to seeing you, Martin, and
Absolutely.
all your viewers down in the streets.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, my final word. There's a moment in The Simpsons where Lisa Simpson asks Ned Flanders, "You aren't really signing power of attorney over to my father, are you?" And I feel that we've reached that point with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I appreciate I'm to the left of most, and there's always an issue I'm banging on about, but all of you out there aren't seriously going to let Keys sign this free trade deal, are you? The Trans-Pacific Partnership is going to strip us of the ability to make laws that benefit us. Did you know the only reason we can't have a quota of New Zealand content on TV is because of an earlier trade deal that viewed that as protectionism? If we sign the TPP, the pharmaceutical industry will be able to sue decisions by Pharmac if Pharmac chooses a cheaper medicine than they are offering. If Keys signs a TPP, our medicine prices will rise for no other purpose than corporate profit. The bloody agreement is designed to use the ability to challenge a funding procurement decision by Pharmac to intimidate the process and add the legal costs of their challenge to factor into awarding the contract. I get that hollow feeling that John is going to return from town having sold all of our cows for a handful of TPP magic beans. The 5 spy chiefs involved in the Echelon spy program all met in New Zealand this week, and their meeting on the eve of the TPP should remind us that this isn't just a one-sided trade deal, it's also a security leash that we are being integrated into with all the subtlety of the Borg. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content. so you can see more of New Zealand on air.